Welcome to Agronomy Moment. I'm your host, Wendell Cohen. We bring in people who agree with me, disagree with me, and above all, are not afraid to say it like it is. Our goal here is to challenge what we think, understand the why behind agronomical advice, and most of all, eliminate the noise in the room that are distractions so we can focus on the information that is relevant to your situation. A moment called now. All living things need the here and now. Crops won't grow with rain next month, sunshine this fall, or the right nutrient applied next year. Decisions to protect the life of living things require us as parents, leaders, and farmers to make decisions for the moment and in the moment. This makes farming fast-paced with limited information to act upon. This podcast is about farmers making decisions in the moment for end results that last not only a month, a season, or year, but a lifetime. Ultimately, even your children's future. Your crop needs a decision in the moment. Your farm needs a decision in the moment. And that's where we come in. Come for the agronomy and stay for the fun. Let's make decisions that increase your potential. Welcome back, everybody, here to Agronomy Moment. I'm really excited today because for quite a few months, Selena and I have been talking about pH and base saturation as it relates to some input and feedback. And by the way, if you have topics you want us to research, to look into, Bex has tremendous resources, and a lot of what we have relates to Bex PFR, the Practical Farm Research, agronomy resources like Crop Talk, and the wide range of agronomists across Beck's marketing territory. And so today...
You don't have to listen to Wendell or I.
That's right. You don't have to listen to us all the time. It's for sure not me. But today we were thinking about this pH topic, and the more we studied it over Christmas holidays, at least for myself, the more and more in the weeds I became until finally I realized, other than spending years and years of trying to slowly absorb some of this, maybe we could have a faster solution, and that was to call Jon Skinner. And he is a regional agronomy manager for Beck's Hybrids in the Illinois area. Jon, welcome here to this podcast. Can you tell us, is Illinois your only region?
Hey, Wendell. Hey, Selena. Thanks for having me. Wendell, I cover Illinois and I cover Iowa, so I work with the agronomy teams in both those states for the time being.
Gotcha. Okay. I stand corrected on that. Illinois and Iowa. So welcome here today. Today we're going to talk about pH and base saturation, and I feel like we have some interesting points on this coming up. And so without further ado, we're going to dive right into this. First of all, Jon, talk to us a little bit about just kind of be really technical for a moment and talk about pH. What is it?
Yeah, so pH is a measure of the hydrogen atoms in the soil. And so we look at soils that have acidic pHs that are going to be those that trend below 7. 7 is a basic soil, so that's the baseline for you. Anything trending below that tends to be on the acidic side. And when we get above that, we're talking about alkali soils or alkalinity that will affect your crop nutrient there. So pH is a measure of hydrogen atoms and what they do within the soil.
Perfect. Next, let's talk about how it affects us. So what are these hydrogen atoms and how they affect nutrient availability? Let's talk about corn a bit and soybeans and the effect on them.
Yeah, so when we look at pH, one of the factors in most of the areas that I deal with is going to come into play when we get into those acidic pHs. So when we drop our pH down, when we start getting below 6 into those mid 5s, that's when we start talking about our macronutrients having availability issues. So you're going to talk about things like potassium and phosphorus being the two main drivers there. But then as you slide even farther, if you get down below 5.5 into the real acidic range, into the blueberry range, I like to call it, then we start talking about a lot of tie-up of micronutrients and an extreme tie-up of our macronutrients. So pH is a key driver in nutrient availability. Now, on the high side of things, if you blow past 7 and get into the mid 7s, we start talking about iron deficiency. We do see some of those other macronutrients become deficient at that time too, and so we run into some issues with that as well. So that sweet spot is going to be somewhere in that 6.2 to 6.8 range for our corn and soybean production.
Okay, so tell me a little bit, if you would, differentiate between corn and soybeans just a bit. What might be more sensitive to correct pH, if you will?
So my opinion, Wendell, is going to be that soybeans are a crop when we get into an adverse pH range that we see take it a little harder. They tend to have more yield reductions when we get out of our comfortable range of pH. One big thing you look at on the high pH side, so when you get into higher pH on soybeans, and that typically happens as you move north into some of those northern Iowa, Minnesota, Dakota type climates, you'll start seeing iron deficiency chlorosis in soybeans, stunning of the plant, yellowing of the plant. Sometimes in severe situations, you'll see death of the plant as they're in the seedling stage. So that becomes a big concern with a high pH. When we get into more acidic pHs, we start talking about, still again, we will see some stunting of the plant height. We will see some issues with soybean nodulation. So those soybeans like to live in that comfortable pH range, in that 6.3, 6.4 up to 6.8 range. And that's when nodulation of the soybean with those bacteria is most efficient. So we drop below that, we start seeing some nodulation issues. Also, we start seeing availability of potassium become an issue. At that point, potassium is a key driver in plant growth and development. So we'll see shorter plants, we'll see stunted plants, and we'll see plants with less nodules. At the end of the day, what that's going to do is, so the name of the game in soybean yield is you got to have plants per acre, you got to have nodes per plant, you got to have pods per nodes, seeds per pods, and then seed size. So if you reduce one of those factors, specifically in this, when dealing with pH, we see a stunted plant, a shorter plant, we're going to reduce the number of nodes on that plant, which is going to offset or decline every single other factor that came beyond that. So when we reduce the number of the nodes, we potentially have less nodulation to fix nitrogen for that plant. We see a reduction in yield that, and as temperamental as soybeans are sometimes, once you hit that point, it's hard to overcome it. Whereas on corn, it can naturally handle a more acidic pH, but at the same time, if we have a reduction in ear length, we got hybrids now that can make that up in kernel flex or kernel depth. And so we tend to see easier management, or my opinion is that it's easier to manage corn in a adverse pH environment than it is to manage soybeans.
Very interesting. I want to change it just a little bit here to talking about drought, dry soils, the decline of pH. And we're talking climate here, more in a broad spectrum. How does this affect pH, or does it even? Is it even worth a mention?
Yes. So the quick and dirty answer to how drought slows the decline of pH all has to do with water. Typically, when we see water introduced to a soil environment, that's when we start to see those chemical reactions happen, and you see the reduction of pH over time. That's why we've been this standard recommendation of liming every 4 years, is because that's how long it's taken for that water to interact, break down the actual lime particles that we put out there, and be effective in the soil. The other thing that comes to mind is if you track the collection of rainwater, lots of universities, lots of folks have tracked acidity of rainwater over time. And so since the introduction of the Clean Air Act and lower amounts of sulfur from atmospheric deposition, meaning essentially acid rain, if we look back 20, 25 years ago, the typical pH of our rainwater was in that mid-5 range, so fairly acidic. When we look at it now, we're in the low to mid-6s on rainfall pH. Okay, So you're not introducing an acidic solution to your soil, which would cause a decline in soil pH. But you think about it, an inch of water over an acre is going to be roughly around 27,000 gallons of water. So as we have that 27,000 gallons of water now with a higher or more basic pH, you're not going to have the effect on the soil you had. So that's a little data to back up. When you don't have water present, period, you typically don't see that soil have a change in pH. Now, I will say, if we get in more arid regions where irrigation is present and we look at a high level of evaporation from the soil, sometimes, depending on the water source, you will have an accumulation of salts there. That can drive a pH in the wrong direction if you're not careful there. So drought affects slow the decline of pH, yes, but it all has to do with water and the water source we're looking at.
Gotcha. So like in irrigated situations where there's high salt contents, the pH is going to tend to climb, right? It'll be more alkaline.
Yes, you're going to tend to climb with those. That's why in a lot of those, if you think about some soybean varieties that are in those longer windows, you see some that have excluders and salt excluders in them. That's a big benefit for those because just through the groundwater source has a level of sodium in it. You apply that to stay ahead of the drought or stay ahead of the heat, you're going to get evaporation. You're going to leave with minimal salt in those soil environments, and that could cause a climb in pH.
Yeah, I'm glad we brought up the point there on that Clean Air Act, just so we kind of correlated the acid and sulfur to one another, just making that correlation. So
I find it very intriguing and interesting because I did not know that the rain had changed. Although I do remember, John, you remember when you were young listening to, maybe in school about acid rain and things, and that's not really talked about now, is it?
No, I mean, I don't
think it's something that.
Yeah, it's something it's been cleaned up a lot. And if you look at the sulfur deposition maps over time, you can get it from USDA or any climate corporation that it's drastically decreased, especially Wendell, where you're at. Where I'm at, I get probably 25% more sulfur deposition than you do, just being closer to the East Coast. And so it's an interesting dynamic there. And so that leads into another topic of applied sulfur, but that's for another day.
Yes, that is another trick. We better not, otherwise we will never pull out of this dive. I'll talk about, let's change again to insects, diseases, weeds, and the effects of, how does pH affect our ability to control some of these pests, if you would, just a little bit.
Yeah, I'll give you the quick and dirty on this. I am not a herbicide expert by any means. You have one of those in Missouri there named Alex Long.
Yes.
If you got to phone a friend, that's your guy to do it.
Yeah.
What I will say, though, is that soil pH will drastically affect your weed bank. So there are certain species of weeds that just like crops that like to grow in more acidic conditions, there are certain species that like to grow in more alkali conditions. And you can find research, you can find information that says, hey, if I got a flush of velvet weed that grows out there, or velvet leaf that grows out there, more than likely my pH is going to be in this range. It also plays heavily into the effect of soil-applied residual herbicides.
Yes.
When we see drastic swings in pH, we do see some groups of active ingredients that have less efficacy versus certain weeds. And I think, Wendell, you brought it up, and Selena, you've seen it too over time, where you got the same herbicide programs on essentially neighboring farms. One works fantastic, the other one is a total dud. And those things come into mind, that pH is a driver in that, especially on those soil-applied residual products.
Gotcha. And talk a little bit about plant diseases and how pH might, I'm not saying it is direct, but could be a correlation to disease control.
Yeah, we all know that potassium availability can be tied up a little bit as we move into more acidic pH conditions. potassium is a huge driver in amino acid components that are natural plant defense mechanisms. So as we see a reduction in potassium availability, a reduction in potassium within the plant, we have a lot of building blocks, a lot of proteins that rely on potassium to have those natural plant defense mechanisms. And so we could see an increase in foliar leaf diseases in those situations.
Gotcha. One last thing, I mentioned insects, but I was actually more even thinking a little bit about SCN populations. Is there any effect of pH on cyst nematodes? Or
if I would make a correlation, as our pH declines, our nematode index increases. A lot of times when I see lower pHs and we have cyst nematode problems, those populations rise in lower pHs.
Okay, I got you. And are we talking technically anything below like 6 or 5.5 more? I mean, we're talking fairly acidic. It does get more.
Yeah, typically we can do a lot. We can have a lot of corrective action. We can have a lot of fertility plans when we're talking in that 5, 7 and above range. Once we start dropping below there, we get pretty spicy on some things. I mean, we get nematodes blow through the roof. We get fertility interactions that are less than desirable. And so when we get into those ranges, things can get a little dicey. Now, I mean, I've been working with the farm recently. A guy just picked it up. We got soil pHs that are below 5, and
oh, wow,
it's not been managed well in those situations. Fortunate, it's a heavier soil. It's a more loamy soil, so we're not having a cyst interaction there. But our potassium availability, our fertilizer availability is very, very poor.
Gotcha. Talking about pH and amendments, I was curious, do CECs have any factor in this here as far as it relates to the capacity of the cations, or what's your thoughts?
Absolutely. CEC plays a big role in the amount of cations that can be stored in that soil. So if we look at a CEC, the number of exchange sites, typically as our CEC increases, that means we have a higher clay content in the soil. With a higher clay content means potential for more exchange sites. So as we increase our CECs, typically we have that soil is able to buffer more. Clay content buffering capacity is a huge thing that we look at. And so a lot of times on your notes there, we got buffer pH listed. A lot of times those tighter clay-based soils are more resistant to change from a liming application than those that have a lower CEC present in them, which would be in a larger pore size, more sandier based soil for simplicity.
Gotcha. So we need to remember that as we amend our soils or try to amend them to understand what our capacity of our soil is and its clay content.
Yeah. And so if you look at your soil test, typically on a soil test, you'll see a pH row. It's on the far right. Then you'll see a buffer pH in there. So a buffer pH will, I'm not going to say always, but a buffer pH is typically slightly higher than what your pH reading is on there. And what you look at on that, it's a great indicator of how resistant your soil is to change. So if I'm looking at a soil that's got a pH reading of 6.0 and a buffer pH of 6.8, that soil is going to be very receptive to change, meaning if I apply a ton of lime, I'm going to see a great improvement in my soil pH. Now, if that same soil had that 6.0 pH had a buffer pH of 6.2, that means that soil is going to be more resistant to change from liming materials than the one with a buffer pH of 6.8. So that's a quick and easy way to look at it and be like, all right, even though I want to take my pH to 6.4, 6.5. I got a 6.2 buffer pH. I'm gonna need increased tonnage there of liming material to get me to where I want to be versus the next soil type over that maybe a 6 pH and a 6.8 buffer pH.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So that range or that difference between the two is what defines how easy it is to amend or how much material.
That's right.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this podcast for pH, and we are going to continue this conversation down the road where Jon Skinner continues to talk about other parts of the soil dynamic. The next one up will be on base saturation and what that is, how we look at it, and then we will have a third podcast with Jon Skinner in which he will bring all of these two together into a summary in helping us name what our number one priority is as we look at soil samples in our farms and what he likes to focus on to make sure those things are right. Those are our number one things to make sure are right. It's a good summary. So this is number one of 3, and we'll be back soon. See ya. If you want alerts on what we are finding in the field, go to topagservices.com/signups to receive alert, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is our goal to bring you the most recent and advanced information possible. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to reach out to us anytime. We also ask you that you give us a like and follow our channel wherever you listen to your podcasts or watch these videos. This ultimately helps us reach more people like you.
Hello?
Hey, this has been Wendell Cohen, your show host. Thank you to all who made this show possible. This show is over. See ya.